presentation draws on joint work with Adele Morris at the Brookings Institution and Peter Wilcoxon, who's at Brookings and Syracuse. It's based on a paper that's available at the Harvard Belfair Centre website, Climate Policy, Climate Diplomacy Proposal, Carbon Price Consultations, and it draws very naturally and follows very naturally on what Marty was saying about how do you practically go from the quantity targeting world to a price targeting world. It draws extensively, although the paper itself is not analytically rigorous, it draws extensively on a number of published papers. One was a paper with Pete and Adele looking at how do you compare climate commitments, and we come up with a methodology for calculating carbon price equivalence. This is the same sort of idea that we have in international trade literature, where we take all the distortions in trade and convert them into tariff price equivalents. Once you get the prices, you can compare them, and then you can negotiate a lower price. And that's worked in the trading world. We believe it would work in the climate world. And not only is it useful for comparing the efforts of countries, but it also enables you to construct a carbon price treaty, which is what Marty was after. The second paper it draws on is another paper with Pete and Adele, which was called A Copenhagen Collar, Achieving Comparable Effort Through Carbon Price Agreements. And this takes the methodology for how you calculate carbon price equivalence, and it comes up with an idea of maybe the negotiations shouldn't be just on targets. And targets will always be the political preference of politicians, because you can see a target, you can feel a target, and they like targets. But realistically, leave the targets in there, but create a dual compliance treaty. That is, you either achieve a target, but if you fail to achieve the target, if you can demonstrate that you've complied by hitting a carbon price ceiling or a carbon price floor, then you've satisfied the commitment. And so it's a way of having dual compliance and bringing pricing into the negotiations. So the question then is, how do you get carbon prices into a formal agreement? And this is this idea of carbon price consultations. We advocate creating this process now. It's a process that we need to do. And really it's a detailed, pragmatic and ongoing set of discussions between countries and between people who are involved in designing cap and trade and tax systems. And it fits into the negotiations because there's a big hole. There's been a lot of issues that have been negotiated in this UNFCCC process, but the one thing that's missing really is carbon pricing. So what we need is a shift in the paradigm. And the shift is to get away from the idea that carbon pricing is just a national issue. It should be that carbon pricing is part of the international talks. And this gives an opportunity for negotiators to talk about how do you do this in the most cost-effective way. And there are a lot of advantages. Why should we do this? Well, firstly, the problem we have in the negotiations is that it's largely the environment ministries that are negotiating, and we need to bring in the trade and the treasuries. Once you get the trade officials and treasury officials, you will naturally switch away from the technical innovation type discussions to how do you do carbon pricing. That's currently missing. Secondly, we have a lot of cases now where countries have attempted to implement carbon pricing. And so we do have a lot of different experience, and it'd be very useful for countries to talk to each other about what worked and what failed. And there's even cases where we don't have very much carbon pricing, take for example in the US, but there's an enormous experience in how to administer other sorts of taxes. And so the technical difficulty of running a tax system is something that countries do need to talk to each other about. Now, the other reason for doing this is that the talks to date have really focused on the targets. And it's easy to negotiate a 2-degree target for the world, but it's incredibly difficult to work out what policies do you have to implement. And so the idea that we focus on what do you do, not what do you promise, is important. And there is this problem, and it came up yesterday in Gibbs' presentation and other presentations about border tax adjustments and all of these offsetting policies that are required when countries aren't cooperating. But by having carbon price consultations, we believe that we will put in the front the relative competitiveness issues that countries need to talk about. And so this brings to the table some of the problems which, if everyone does it together, you don't need to worry about the border tax adjustment issues. So what's the goal of a CPC would be really to make people more comfortable about talking about and discussing carbon pricing, sharing their views, and enable a mechanism for dispute resolution, etc. The question is, how do you design this? And really, this is meant to be just a practical idea that basically you start with focusing on the administrative and economic and trade-related aspects of carbon pricing. And Then you could also bring in the agencies. There's a lot of analytical support out there. There's a lot of work being done at the IMF, at the OECD. The technical centralised support is already available, in addition to the national research and policy analysis that's going on. The question is, where does this fit? You can't just say, tomorrow we're going to start doing this inside the UNFCCC process. But what you could do is you could bring it in through the major emitters forum, or even better, bring it in through the G20, so that you have the trade and economic agencies talking to each other. Sorry, I've completely... Okay. Okay, we'll maybe come back if there's a question. The main issue here is, though, to get it out of the purview of the environment agencies into the trade and finance areas. Why is it important? Well, we think it's important because what we want to do is have the CPC focusing on the pragmatic details of carbon pricing, rather than this very divisive debate of who pays, who's responsible, who should compensate who. We really want to design the economic instruments that will actually reduce CO2 emissions at lowest cost. And then we could then evolve, as this process evolves, it becomes a mechanism for negotiating a uniform price. And this comes to the point that Marty was raising and others have raised, Bill Nordhaus and Will Coxon and myself over many years. How do you actually get a harmonised global price? You can't get it, in our view, unless you have this practical process that's building towards it. So we argue that this enables a paradigm shift, and eventually the UNFCCC negotiations could then shift away from purely targets and timetables to targets and timetables with some form of carbon pricing commitment built into the negotiations. And this is an advantage because one of the big problems with targets and timetables is it could well be, if you're a country and you've committed to a target, the future turns out to be different than you thought, then you could be committing to a very high cost. And by having the carbon price process as part of the targeting negotiation, you can actually put a safety valve or a price cap on the process. And again, this is that same point. So what's the next steps? Well, obviously the next step would be to put the CPC process on the table at the G20. And unfortunately, this is not going to happen because of the debacle, which I'll talk about in the next session, about how we tried to do carbon pricing in Australia, where we designed a very badly designed policy, and surprise, surprise, it collapsed the first opportunity the political process gave it to collapse. More details are at my website, sensiblepolicy.com, and I'm very happy to stop here within the time limit, Rob.